So we've had a really insightful hour, I guess, of learning about what's happening in the industrial market and the office market. And one of the common themes that has been highlighted is about sustainability and ESG. So it is obviously a very important topic. So I'm very pleased to have the panelists here today. So we've got Tim from Womble from Dickinson, Johnny Trice from the Meraviglia, Abby Bartlett. Professionally from Womble, Alex from NatWest, and Kev Marsh from Savills. So we're going to go straight into it. Abby, I'm going to come straight to you actually. So as a sustainability consultant, how do you contribute to enhancing the environmental performance of real estate assets, particularly in terms of EPC, which obviously was covered quite a lot in the previous sessions? But can you just share some examples of projects where EPC ratings have played a crucial role in achieving sustainability goals?
Thank you, Nana. It's a really interesting question, and I talked to you beforehand a bit about EPCs, didn't I? One of the challenges we find is that the EPC is misleading in terms of the actual energy consumption of an asset. So we wouldn't just focus on the EPC when we're trying to help a building improve its sustainability credentials. That will be part of the picture because the regulations require it. But actually, it's the stuff that's not covered by the EPC that we're really interested in. So it's commonly used as a tool of benchmarking buildings and focuses on the regulated energy, so the heating, the cooling, the ventilation. But actually, up to 50% of the energy consumption of that building is not covered by the EPC, which depends on the building type, and that's a huge gap. So what we do is using detailed energy modelling and tools, we run assessments such as neighbours and TM54 analysis, depending on the type of building and where things are going, to dig into that detail and understand. I think on the last panel, they were talking about industrial processes, for example. Your EPC won't cover the energy consumption of those processes. So it's actually digging into that detail and understanding it so you can reduce the energy consumption properly for the building. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention the wider side of things as well. I know on the first panel there was a lot of talk around health and well-being, and that's really echoes with what we're seeing. So it's obviously energy is a really huge part of sustainability, but it's only one part of the picture, and we would always encourage people to look more holistically at everything. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, but it's...
Well, you've answered it. It's great. You're absolutely right that when we talk about sustainability, a lot of people are thinking about energy consumption when actually there's the social values, the economic values, which a lot of key stakeholders don't actually take into full consideration. Just going to actually come to Alex. So can you, obviously, Alex, your role in terms of the climate opportunities lead, so what does that actually mean? What are you doing for your clients? And how are you supporting them?
So I suppose my role is focusing on the property space, but particularly in terms of the opportunities, that's really important to think through rather than just the risks associated with climate. And the way that we try to support our clients is by providing solutions from a financial perspective, of course, and support them in terms of the transitioning. We understand that lots of clients are not necessarily in a place where they're already providing climate solutions, and therefore we really need to try and help them kind of get to that point, reducing their energy consumption, improving the approach that they have to sustainability. My focus is specifically on climate, but we have a much broader sort of program, of course, across NatWest Group. So really it's about supporting customers sort of running through and delivering against their own transition targets and against their own climate and sustainability targets. And this is fundamentally important because in the ESG space, the focus across the investor, so across all of our stakeholder groups, investors, customers, regulators, the communities is so heightened in terms of what the expectation is of corporates, but also sort of smaller and medium-sized companies. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And then in terms of the importance of the EPC ratings that obviously Abby touched on, so how is that informing the investment decision that you're giving the occupiers a bit more choice?
Sure. So I concur. EPC is not the full story, it's a part of it. I think one of the key elements, EPC or beyond EPC, I think one of the key elements is around understanding what the potential of buildings in terms of improvements and enhancements are. And EPC is one piece that can help understand what their journey can be. I also can say that from our perspective, we believe that improvements to EPCs themselves need to be definitely are required. We've talked about this in the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition report, which we are part of the coalition, so NatWest Group is part of the coalition, and the report has just come out in mid-September. And we talked about the fact that actually encapsulating or integrating a carbon stance, and that there isn't just, because at the minute EPCs are really more focused on energy consumption and they have a cost bias, they don't particularly think through about carbon abatement per se. But as Abby just said, is much more holistic than that. It's about understanding what the potential is. It's about helping people go through their journey. It's about helping people compute in a way such that they can actually put forward a compelling business case. It's combining the commercial potential with the sustainable potential. And that's, again, really important in a world where the market demands of investors and demands of landlords, but also occupiers, especially where they are big corporates, that they demonstrate how seriously they put the money where their mouth is in terms of their sustainability journey. If you have a high spec, from a sustainability perspective, a high quality building provides that support to demonstrate your commitment to that journey.
Great, thank
Hopefully
you.
that helps.
Obviously, we're all hearing the same sort of stories that the growing importance of ESG in real estate. So John, I'm going to come to you, because how are you assisting industrial clients in driving real environmental impacts in the real estate, whether it's investment or operations, and are there any particular technologies that you're recommended to achieve sustainability goals?
I think, fitting with what everyone's saying, basically, it's pretty clear that the definition of what a prime building is evolving to include all the topics we're talking about. There are many experts in the room that will go through a long list of all the widgets and gizmos that can go onto a building that make it sustainable, that make it attractive. And I think that raises probably a key point, and it's what everyone's alluding to. The market's getting a lot more savvy about what is actually of value and what is effectively a marketing tool, in the simplest way put. And what's quite a good example of that, I guess, is so we've seen on many occasions when we're acquiring industrial units, for example, they'll have photovoltaic cells on the roof. Fantastic, it's all part of that sort of ESG criteria. However, the landlord will have chosen not to install batteries to store that energy. From a user's perspective, if you don't have consistent power, you don't know what's coming off the photovoltaics, to a certain degree it's useless. So yes, it's not the grid, but is that actually benefiting the tenant? So it's just things like that. Tenants getting more savvy, I completely agree. I would think EPC is either got to evolve or it's going to become redundant. I think most people realise it's probably not as useful as some of the other criteria. What I think is a really interesting evolution that fits in very nicely what you're saying is, and what I would encourage landlords to do, is to focus on what data they can actually take out of their buildings. Again, by just putting all these instruments and this equipment in is great, but tenants who are now reporting to their stakeholders, whether that's their end customers or whether, are having to report this data and information. And we, Omega, are really going through B Corp certification. It's a great example. We have to provide the energy consumption data of the building we operate from. You go and speak to a landlord, he just sends you an invoice for whatever that doesn't cut it. So you're seeing landlords installing much more equipment, building management systems that can actually feed that live information to their tenants. And that's probably the key thing I would put on top of all the lists that we've said.
Brilliant. I'm going to come to you. So in terms of the leisure and retail sectors, again, we're touching upon a lot of the sustainability aspect, but there's also the social values as well that we need to cover. But how do you see ESG principles being incorporated into real estate decisions, and what benefits can this bring to your clients?
Sure. So I kind of think hospitality is probably looks at ESG in an entirely different direction than the overwhelming majority of occupiers. And I think Fuller's rebranded their ESG policy, planet, people, and then accountability. And the people aspect of it is incredibly important, because if you look after people, you're looking after your customers. If you're looking after your customers will spend more money with you. And so what we have seen, I think, in the hospitality world is an emphasis on placemaking. I think from a high street perspective, and some of those high streets have, I think, really developed the placemaking really well. I go back to Pavilion Road in Knightsbridge as a great example of what the Cadogan Estate have done with an entirely road full of independent retailers and cafes and restaurants and so on. But in its smaller sense, somewhere like Marketplace in Romsey, with the improvements that Test Valley Borough Council have done into the Market Square, into Palmerston Square, and then how the market stalls and the cafes and stuff like that have changed the face of that area. So hospitality is burdened by massive energy consumption, and it is an ongoing problem, a problem that doesn't really have the capital behind it to solve it with technology easily. But the people aspect of it is incredibly important, and I think that you're seeing an awful lot of emphasis on the way in which we're looking after customers that are coming through, as well as the staff that work in these venues as well.
Thank you. So Tim, I'm just going to come to you. There's another mic on the table. But as a solicitor specialising in real estate, how do you advise your clients to incorporate ESG principles into their real estate transactions, and the green leases that obviously Nicola mentioned as well?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along today, Nella. We talked a lot about EPCs, and the starting point is that is the focus. As a lawyer, say you have to have compliance in these. That's what we're about, ensuring these are legally compliant. So there is very much a primary focus on EPCs. However, as a profession, we are taking it further than that, and we do incorporate in our standard documents. Obviously, clients can choose not to incorporate it. More green and darker green proposals. In fact, I don't know if anybody here has heard of the Chancery Lane project, which is a very dark green, I would say, initiative to produce clauses not just in real estate, across all legal documents, which are part of the sort of quest for net zero. And they actually rate their own clauses as to whether they are net zero or simply sort of towards net zero compliant. And we're starting to see those clauses appear in leases, and they talk about much more, the measuring, the monitoring, even about materials. So there'll be a requirement on alterations for tenants to seek to use reused materials to start with, then use recycled materials, then recyclable materials, and only if you can't use any of that do you resort to us. And that's quite interesting. That's pushing quite a sort of strong green agenda. My sense is that that's sort of at the cutting edge at the moment. People aren't necessarily embracing that, but there is a lot of enthusiasm. We've had the office and industrial conversations before this, and I think all the panel here is recognising a lot of conversations thinking, hang on, they're starting to take our words out of our mouths, so we're going to have to think of something else to say. We didn't talk about retail, and I think in the retail sector there is more tension, because retailers very much, literally, they have a shop window, they have a fit out, which is meant to attract customers in. Their sustainability is focused more on their products than necessarily the environment in which they are selling their product. And of course, retailers are having to compete just to get people into the shops in the first place rather than use Amazon or Etsy or whatever. So, creating a good environment is more important than creating a sustainable environment. And we do have a lot of tension between retailers in terms of even on the EPC provisions. And equally, the measuring and monitoring, that's great and probably a lot easier to do in an office. But for retailers, for instance, if you've got 1,000 stores across the country and you've got landlords requiring all these different measuring and monitoring requirements, you're never going to be able to comply with that. You'll just provide whatever information you have. And yes, retailers, as with all occupiers, are monitoring, are looking to reduce energy consumption. So the information is there. The question is, what can you do with it if you're getting different information from different sources according to different standards and measurements? So there is a lot that we are doing. I focused on the green. I was really pleased that our members of the panel talked about the social and governance side of it. That's harder to include. Again, there are basic requirements, so leases will require tenants to comply with the Equality Act, the Modern Slavery Act, anti-bribery, whatever. Going beyond that into things like the living wage, it's quite interesting. When I asked my colleagues for examples of what they'd seen, they said, well, we've seen on the Covent Garden estate, it's not a requirement, but it's an aspiration by Shaftesbury Estate. So we subscribe to the London living wage, and we expect our tenants to do the same. They don't enforce that, but it's putting that expectation in there. And that's really interesting to see that coming through. It's being taken so seriously across the board.
Kevin, are you able to actually add to that in terms of the landlords that you're supporting? Obviously, with retail, it's normally shell and shell fit out, right?
Yeah, I'd echo an awful lot of what you say, actually, is that our industry is under massive pressure financially. And so it is incredibly difficult to choose to use much, much more expensive product to create your environment just because of where that product comes from. So there is certainly a conflict at the moment because of the trading conditions in which we find ourselves. As far as landlords are concerned, I think it's sort of helpful from a social perspective, having exited out of COVID and found that actually the tenants that they tried to pay their rent were the independent tenants. And then coming back to the people side of things, that the idea that a landlord and a tenant can work together in order to find a solution to something is pretty helpful. And I think that is much, much easier to do when you have independent tenants to work with as a landlord than when you might have Prezzo or the likes of, whose brand is going to always take precedence over anything else that you might want to achieve. So again, I would say that the active landlords are the ones that we probably find it easiest to work with. The passive ones, frankly, don't give a monkeys.
And that's something that we kind of need to educate and raise that self-awareness of what's actually happening in the kind of the climate agenda. And so, Abby, just going to come to you because we obviously know why it's important. So can you just share some examples of actually how you've helped clients to achieve that carbon reduction, resource conservation, and that community engagement?
Is that working? Yeah, lovely. So related to that, and it will answer your question vaguely, I'm certain. It's really interesting. I want to go back to the retail side of stuff because we've actually worked with some retail providers, some larger scale ones, and they have been embedding the ESG principles into their standard fit out specs now. We're seeing that more and more. So I think to go back to what you're saying, Ella, it's helping our clients understand how to embed the principles in the most effective way. So rather than ticking a box and saying we're going to stick a meter here and it's going to do this, it's actually taking the time to understand and inform those standard specifications for the fit outs and to make sure that it all works and they've got a holistic big picture but can still drill down into the nitty gritty as well. So one of the ways we've been helping is by looking at standard specs. we've been looking an awful lot at energy, and I keep on coming back to energy, and I know I said myself it's a bigger picture than just that, but I want to really reinforce the neighbours and the TM54 approaches and how important they are. When we look at the EPC, we see a summary figure which gives you a guideline and answers to what the mechanisms legally need to say. But to really help an organisation understand and reduce their energy, you need that detailed analysis. And for anyone that's ever looked at a neighbour's assessment tool, it's not a fun thing to try and understand. There's an awful lot of tabs, there's a lot of detail that goes in, but you can't fill that in isolation. So you need to speak to the end user, you need to speak to those people that are going to be operating in that building to complete it. So that collaboration that people have been talking about on the panel is key. We cannot help people if they don't collaborate with us. So gone are the days where you can throw a bit of money at it and say, right, give me a sustainable building. The client needs to be a part of that picture, and if they're not, you just don't get anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was highlighted from John in the previous section, where he talked about key stakeholders actually coming together. So Johnny, maybe you could add, because I know that you're a massive fan of neighbours, not the sitcom, but if you could just elaborate in terms of your advice that you're giving to your clients and from an acquisition point of view, and how important is it?
First of all, it's an education piece, explaining what these things mean, and I get it from a non-real estate specialist perspective. What is neighbours? What are all these things? So it's a question of explaining what that means.
So what is neighbours?
Australian soap.
Yeah, sure. We'll how we take that one in detail. But I think 100% it was referenced in a previous panel. There is a big clash between effectively who's going to pay for these works, particularly on secondary buildings. If a change of regulation, or when a change of regulation comes during that lease period, and landlords are trying to shoehorn that through a service charge, tends to saying, well, hang on, it's not a service charge item, it always becomes a big debate. So again, probably part of the drafted lease is always key to solving that solution. I think an echo point made earlier, we're definitely seeing as landlords move to decarbonise their properties and move towards full electric systems, that's overloading the grid either nationally or locally, not necessarily leaving enough spare capacity for the tenants to operate. We won't dwell on that to be mentioned before, but that's live stuff going on right now, which is to a certain degree crazy. Also, with a lot of new developments you're seeing in the industrial sector, landlords are choosing to completely ignore B2 use because that is deemed to be a more carbon intensive use than just pure logistics or storage. So those B2 users are being, I guess, sidelined, if you want to put a phrase, which is quite interesting. What does always put a smile on my face with a client of ours phoned us up, having moved into a brand new, very sustainable building. They run an oven within this building. They phoned us up and said the roller shutter doors being pulled in, effectively because the unit was so well sealed, the change of air pressure when the oven went on just pulled the door through. And in their previous buildings, because it was drafty and leaking, it was never a problem. So it's no one's fault. It's not, it could be solved, but it just shows that rolling out these things does have practical implications. But to reiterate what you were saying, as long as everyone's pushing in the same direction, then it does happen, it does work.
No, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head in the sense of there's a lot of regulations and terminology out there that no one really understands what it all means. I'm halfway through my sustainability course at the moment, and it's intense, and there's things in there that I'm learning, which I didn't even appreciate it. And we're going through that B Corp process, but people that aren't on that route are not really having the knowledge to support it. So I guess this leads on to that greenwashing, because we're all saying we're ESG focused, but are you really? So I guess, how do you, from Tim, like from your perspective, how do you actually comply within the leases that you're producing to make sure that people actually understand what they're signing up for?
That's a very interesting question. I had a look, or I got one of my willing team to do some research for me. And the statistics on EPCs, and I know that they're getting a bit of a battery now, but so in the quarter from April to June, 99% of EPCs were E or above. Only 0.5% were F and 0.5% G. That clearly had nothing to do with changing law in April, making it unlawful to let a building E. So there clearly is some greenwashing out there. But again, as a lawyer, and I go back to this, we're about compliance. So you can't get away from the requirements. If a tenant is procuring a new building and they want a BREEAM certification that's excellent, outstanding, whatever, that's what has to be achieved. If there are sort of sustainability measures that have to be achieved, there's objective requirements there which would need to be secured. So I would say I see limited examples of greenwashing. I'm not seeing lip service. You're talking to people, they might say, well, 5 years ago, ESG was something that people would virtue signal in their reports. But actually, it's been socialised. It's become something that people are really believing in. So I'm really not seeing the same level of greenwashing. It's if you say come back onto retailers, and I'm certainly not suggesting that retailers are sort of burning sort of coal in the back of their store. But it's kind of, they just don't like being told by landlords what to do. It's, there's a chapter, they have their own sort of green approaches, and if you're a large business, that's what we want to do. And I think there's a lot of, it's fine to have these provisions in leases. Sometimes they are unenforceable, it's about working together, and it's really encouraging that dialogue. As you say, the end user and the building owner have to collaborate. Possibly easier on a multi-let building, an office, where occupiers, businesses in the office, just as we talked about earlier today, are really keen on that sort of sustainable environment. Apart from anything, your staff, your employees, all stakeholders, they want to see that you are compliant. And you're keen to jump in.
That's all right. So completely agree, but I think the really important thing is, so we've got green leases and tenants know they need to abide by it. Is there a mechanism by which it's proven? And I'll answer my own question. So we've got, so B Corp is something you guys are looking at, okay? And that's great because it's a recognised third-party accreditation scheme that proves that you're going through that process. When it comes to our buildings, there are certification schemes that we can apply. So BREEAM is my day job, so to hear it mentioned made my heart sink. And that's sad, I know, but that's where I'm from. And BREEAM is going through a revolution at the moment, and they've got a new version due out next year. And I think we will see a lot more focus on in-use, because they recognise at the moment there is a BREEAM in-use scheme that you could apply, that your tenants could then go through that process to prove they are actually doing all these different things that they're talking about in their ESG agenda, etc. But it's not really very easy to apply at the moment. And the great thing is it looks beyond energy. So there will be stuff in net zero, there'll be stuff to do with the social implications, social value is a really important part of it. And it will give us a mechanism whereby there'll be an audit trail to really robustly demonstrate the things that have happened. Because I think that's where it falls over. And I think a lot of organisations don't want to be greenwashing, they want to be practicing what they're talking about, but the mechanism to prove that isn't quite there. So until we have that mechanism available that people can pick up and run with, I think the industry is limited on that side of things, which is why for energy, neighbours is great, because that's a mechanism, again, that's provable.
Brilliant. Alex, if I can.
Thank you. I would also add, from our perspective, I think back to the data point that is absolutely key. So my background is also in disclosures, and one of the things that we have been struggling with, and we will continue to struggle with in the social space, much more so, and in the nature and biodiversity we haven't touched on, but it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle here, is around having data that allows for that sort of reporting to be actually standardized sufficiently such that people, our stakeholders, they look at our disclosures every year. And the banks, but obviously here we're talking about commercial real estate. The disclosures that are done by the corporates that sit in those, that occupy those buildings, and the disclosures that are done by the investors that invest in those buildings need to demonstrate clearly that they are doing the things that they have stated and have committed to doing. And that's where I think beyond the lease is like a real key problem around the greenwashing. And that's where a lot of corporates are very worried about making statements which they can't then demonstrate, because the data is actually really, really difficult. From a climate perspective, we talk about, okay, CO2 abatement is relatively straightforward, although data availability is not, is a big problem. The assumptions underpinning methodologies are, quite varied across different industries and varied across different players within the same industry, which is where SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, helps. But again, when we go beyond the C in the E of the ESG, and we talk about social, that's going to be much harder, and the national biodiversity, the same applies. So that was what I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, amazing. Yeah, I think metrics is going to be key with any commercial real estate going forward, particularly when companies like Equal they've got to give that information on a yearly basis. So just keeping with you, Alison, in terms of your insight, what is the one tip that you can give to our audience to effectively balance that financial consideration with genuine environmental impact?
Yes, so I alluded to it earlier on. I think there are two things that are sort of really pushing organisations across all sorts of industries to focus on embedding ESG consideration into their strategic thinking. On the one side is the stick of the sort of tightening regulations that exist, and they are getting tighter from a sort of needs perspective, but also beyond that. On the other side is the expectation from your stakeholders, so your customers, your investors, the communities you operate within, etc. So you have the carrot, which is there's an expectation that ESG considerations need to be embedded within the products and services that you offer. If you don't, what happens is that part of the market, at least that part of the market that is more interested, or that is interested in the sustainability piece, will be less interested in what you have to offer. There's reputational and there's litigation risks associated with that, of course, as well. And because that chunk of the market is becoming bigger, then obviously you would be precluding yourselves to a bigger size of the market. And on the other side, as I mentioned, there's the regulatory aspect, but also the disclosure. The disclosure space is moving from voluntary to mandated. And so essentially, the tip is to really think through, even if the upfront costs of investments are significant, think about the investment in the ESG space and in the energy efficiency space as almost a future-proofing of your business. That would be the summary.
Well, that comes to the end of our panel session, but is there any questions from the floor? Yeah.
There as well.
Interesting. Oh, sorry. Chris Early, I'm from a connectivity company called Freshway, but I've spent 20 years working for Telefonica O2, and a lot of past that was on the corporate side. So interested to hear about the evolution of green leases, in particular in ESG. I always found that there was just a lot of head banging, really, because when they came in, they were used as a vehicle by the landlord to just chuck a load of obligations in, which the tenant had no clue about until it got to legals, because heads of terms can be a bit threadbare in my experience. And then there'd be a huge clash, A, because the tenant felt it had been ambushed and it was just being passed a load of onerous obligations that were going to cost money. B, it was one-sided because the landlord wasn't playing a part in it, it's just passing this stuff through. C, a big corporate will have its own structure, and as people rightly said, there are a lot of good things going on. A lot of companies, particularly large corporates, have got their own game plan and their own targets, but that's across a portfolio. And then if you've got one building where the landlord's trying to apply a different approach, it doesn't fit in. Has that moved on at all, or are those sort of arguments still going on?
Tim? Or?
Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think Tim had a lot to say on that point. He might be best placed.
Yeah.
I would say yes, the discussions are still there, and you've absolutely nailed it in terms of the landlord, and quite often there will impose green provisions, and the darker they are, the more challenging they are for the tenant to comply with, without necessarily a regard for what the tenant can physically deliver or what the tenant needs to offer. I touched on the point about sort of data, the diversity of data, the fact that if you are a multiple occupier, you can't be monitoring them all, measuring them all in different ways. So there is something of a sort of compromise, and some of my colleagues are working with the industry bodies, so people like the BBC, to find common ground, because it isn't going to work if the landlord just impose that very dark green strong obligation, which isn't going to be compliant. It's just going to lead to more angst in negotiations. So it's finding a way forward, because tenants are willing to cooperate. There is an identity of interest, as we've been talking about, in terms of wanting sustainable buildings that are cheaper to run, that meet all criteria. But it's finding that middle ground. So I would say we're not there yet, but the industry is actively working to find that common ground. Because what we don't want is to go back to the lowest common denominator, where it simply is just ensure that you deliver the building back in no worse EPC rating, or even sort of not below sort of unlawful EPC rating, because that's fairly basic. There's more than that we can do, and there's more cooperation that can be built into the lease. So I think often tenants just want something that's not an absolute obligation, but a sort of a reasonable cooperation.
That's that answer your question. And to make sure the agents are putting up to speed and actually properly engaging on those points, rather than waiting for it to build up to it properly.
Yeah. It wouldn't be the first thing that's dropped into heads of terms as sort of standard text, without the tenant realising the implications, the less sophisticated tenants.
Then that links back in with that links back in with the S, doesn't it, in ESG actually, because as a responsible landlord, you need to be thinking ahead and engaging properly to resolve that, I think.
We've got one last question. Mike's over there.
Hi, it's YC. 1 second. Hi, it's YC here. I'm actually an ex-builder surveyor turned real estate student. Just want to know what's the grace period, should there be one, regarding this energy efficiency fit out transition. So say we now have the EPC standard reform. So again, you can't let out certain certain properties below an EPC rating of C, I believe, by 2027. So is there a grace period for that? And as real estate advisor, what can we do to accurately advise on acquisitions or disposal of properties of that nature?
Johnny?
Well, I think you'll have answered the question. I guess it's a question goes back to the point we're making about education at the very start, and something I pick up on a point you made. We are very much putting these sorts of things into heads of terms now, because, as you quite rightly said, it delays the process at the tail end. There's definitely been a historic mismatch between the knowledge of the landlord and the tenant, if you see what I mean. The landlords are naturally be one step ahead, and the tenant market is catching up pretty quickly. I think we, if we're representing a tenant to answer the question, will always make sure that it's not obliged, the tenant is not obliged to pay for any EPC improvement costs. Landlords will push back. Being straight, sometimes it comes down to what strength of the market is in either direction, where that sort of falls. Certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, I think tenants have seen these things as something in the future to worry about, but now it's coming in very much within the medium term, and people can only focus on certain things for a certain period of time. But yeah, it's a live conversation, and being honest with you, I don't think it's been completely sorted out yet. So there isn't a straight yes or no, or this is how you do it answer. It's a question of education and negotiation. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else want to input? No?
I was just going to say, you said about sort of minimum in 2027. We don't know. The government did its consultation on tightening up the EPC standards in both domestic and non-domestic. The last consultation concluded in 2021. We haven't had a response to that, so we do not know. All we know is what Rishi Sunak announced, that they are, in fact, it's the government's greenwashing, they are softening the approach. Unfortunately, that just creates uncertainty, so we don't know if buildings are going to need to be C by 2027 and B by 2030. They might be, they might not. And what the market likes least of all is uncertainty. So it would be great to know. Obviously, it'd be inconvenient if they suddenly said 2024.
Okay.
To end, sorry, Nana, just to end on a positive note,
Yes.
agreed, the uncertainty is infuriating, but we have seen clients, landlords, tenants, whoever, who are still making those improvements anyway, regardless of the lack of regulation and direction. And I think that's, we as an industry are moving ahead regardless. We know it's coming. We've got targets to hit as the UK in general, so we're just cracking on with it. But it'd be nice to have a bit more of a stick from government, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can just lead it collectively, locally, to make sure that we're bringing the right product forward. So thank you so much for today. So round of applause.